Hello, welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for June 1st, 2014. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. Today I'm joined by, on the phone, we have Jim Clausing. Jim's one of those guys who really keeps his finger on the pulse of what's going on in security. How you been doing, Jim?
Not too bad. It's been a busy week.
All right, good to hear it. Well, I guess good and bad, but keeping busy is always good. And then next to me here we have Matt Kaiser. Matt's one of our security analysts. How are you doing today, Matt?
Not too bad.
Okay.
Also keeping busy as usual.
Yes. Yeah, Matt's been involved in a lot of things the past couple of weeks here. Very busy, heads down. Appreciate your work on a lot of that stuff. And Stan. Stan is another security analyst, malware reverse engineer extraordinaire. How you doing, Stan?
Oh, very good, John. Thanks for asking.
Okay, great. The first topic we have, the big elephant in the room, as it were, in terms of stories this week, is the Zeus Game Over and Cryptolocker botnet takedown. And I think, Matt, you have some information on that. What can you tell us about that one?
So recently, actually, I believe it was just over this weekend, FBI, in coordination with a couple other international law enforcement organizations, as well as some private sector companies in the ISP and antivirus space, coordinated, I wouldn't call it quite a takedown, but a disruption of the Game Over Zeus botnet and the associated Cryptolocker malware. Game Over Zeus was known as a very prolific peer-to-peer version of the old Zeus malware, which the source code had been open source at some point, and a modification had been made for support peer-to-peer functionality. And this is actually a very big deal because peer-to-peer malware is notoriously difficult to take down.
Yeah,
it doesn't have any single point of failure that you can attack if you're trying to take it down. So this coordination is actually quite a feat. So great news for the security community. And Cryptolocker as well was affected. Cryptolocker, you've probably heard of in the news, was the ransomware that would lock a person's computer and using public key cryptography prevent them from getting their data back until they paid a ransom, typically in Bitcoin. So between these two, it's quite a blow to cybercrime. It's great news, I think, for the community, and very excited.
Yeah. So the Game Over botnet, like you said, peer-to-peer. In the past, we've talked about other botnet takedowns. A lot of those use kind of a centralized command and control. Those are a lot easier to take down. Like you said, these peer-to-peer ones, not so much. We know that there's been some attempts in the past. I think we talked about the zero-access botnet, a similar tangent. That one, Microsoft had done some action to try to get that under control. I think Symantec may have as well. And I think Microsoft's actions have really seen some steady decline in it. But back to the point of, the peer-to-peer botnets in general, not easy to get rid of unless you can really get on the endpoints in a lot of cases, like Microsoft had done with their zero-access one. But this one, they're not affecting endpoints. Sounds like they've kind of done some other initiatives to take control of the Game Over, Zeus Game Over botnet. And this one's a big cyber crime one, I guess, has some Russian ties, and I guess both of them are somehow interlocked. The Zeus Game Over and the Cryptolocker are somehow interrelated with each other, and there's some legal action pending regarding that, from what I understand, and in order to get the people responsible behind it.
The big news for our viewers is that US CERT has set up a website that if you are infected or you just want to have a little bit more information about it, you can visit the website, read a little bit more about how Game Over Zeus works, and there's actually a list of tools that you can use to disinfect yourself, which, in light of the takedown, it would be very helpful for the global security community if you are infected, if you would participate in at least that portion of it.
Right. So that's good recommendation to viewers. If you're not sure or you suspect you might have been compromised, take a look at that US CERT page. I think I heard estimates of about 1 million devices worldwide, at least, compromised via this, infected. In some cases, you may have been compromised at one point and cleaned up by your existing antivirus. So changing passwords is always a good recommendation, especially after you've cleaned up. Don't do it before you cleaned up your machine. But there's also a bunch of other advice there on that US CERT website. Give you some guidance around how to determine if you're impacted and what to do if you are.
If you're infected with Cryptolocker, you already know it, and this is not going to get your files back for you. Hopefully, eventually they'll be able to get your keys back to you so you can decrypt all your files, but that isn't the case right now.
Right. And Cryptolocker is probably the worst of the two to get hit by, in my opinion, I'd be a little more fearful of that, because like we've talked about, it encrypts your files on your machine and holds you ransom in order to get your own data back, which is pretty mean-spirited. At least most botnets, they kind of try to hide below the surface and not really make themselves as well known. But the CryptoLocker, like you said, is definitely let you know that it's there.
I would personally disagree. I realize that losing all of your files is a terrible, terrible thing, but I'm more concerned about losing everything in my bank account.
Well, that's true too. Right. Good point. All right. So good discussion on that one. So the other big story this week was regarding the TrueCrypt software, which is a disk file encryption software that a lot of people use. I guess it's open source too. I'm not really sure about it. What can you tell us about this one, Jim? Because I think you looked into this one a little bit more, right?
Yeah, I've been following this one, and on Friday I would have told you this was going to be the big story of the week, and now it got kind of overshadowed by our previous story. But the middle of last week, all of a sudden, the TrueCrypt website redirected to the SourceForge page, and up on their SourceForge page was this big warning: using TrueCrypt is not secure, as it may contain unfixed security issues. There was a new version of TrueCrypt posted on the SourceForge page that only decrypted existing TrueCrypt volumes, would not allow you to create new ones. And it was just a strange announcement. It said, TrueCrypt development ended after Microsoft terminated support for Windows XP, and suggested that you use BitLocker. There was just a lot of confusion in the community about what was going on. Did they get hacked? Did they know about some security vulnerability? Since then, we finally have heard from one of the developers. The developers for TrueCrypt have maintained anonymity. To this date, we don't know who they are. One of them goes by the name of David. He's the one that's been communicating a little bit. They've done a good job of hiding their identities. Basically, the way things look right now, it looks like the developers just got tired of working on it and essentially wanted to kill it off. They didn't think that forking it was a good idea because they didn't think anybody understood their code as well as they did. There's still an ongoing audit, and phase 1 of that had already ended, and phase 2 was about to begin. It is still going to go forward. There is some talk that a fork of this may continue development based out of Switzerland. One of the big reasons that TrueCrypt was such a big deal is that it was cross-platform. You could run TrueCrypt on Macs, on Linux, on every version of Windows, and you could move your encrypted file systems back and forth between them. Some of the alternatives that people have been talking about since this announcement last week, none of them are cross-platform. They talk about using BitLocker on Windows. Well, that's fine if you're running versions of Windows that support BitLocker, but for Windows 7 that was only Enterprise and Ultimate, and for Windows 8 I think it may be Professional and Ultimate, or whatever the highest level one is. But for the consumer versions of those, BitLocker is not an option, and BitLocker only works on Windows. If you're like me and you use Macs and Linux and Windows, you'd have to use a different type, different software package for encrypting on each one, and you can't easily move things back and forth. So, so TrueCrypt was, had a very important niche in the market, and it looks like there are some people who want to keep this going. So I suspect that we will see some new version of it going forward. The audit is going to continue, so we'll know if there are any security vulnerabilities in there, and if there are, I suspect that they'll get fixed. The name will probably change because the license was such that the old developers, maintain the rights to the name. But I think it's going to go forward. No, right now we don't know of any security vulnerabilities. The statement in there was such that, if there's anything found in the future, the original authors were not going to maintain it. Steve Gibson over at Gibson Research has a nice summary of what we know at the moment. The link will be up with the show when it's posted. But if you're interested, you can read through it there. That's pretty much what we know about the whole TrueCrypt thing at this point.
Well, it's a bit of a thankless job. I think the software was great and the code was beautiful. I think it was actually a quote from that blog entry, Jim. It was free, it worked very well. I actually used the software. So it is a loss to see it go. And I see why you might be tired of kind of providing free software for 10 years, maintaining it, and then with the code audit coming up, maybe there wouldn't be major things, but maybe there would be a few bugs probably uncovered here or there they'd probably have to patch or
possibly
something.
just more aggravation than
Yeah.
it's worth for something that you're trying to just develop as something for the public community.
Yes, but they actually, after the results of phase 1 of the audit came out, they were very supportive of it.
Okay.
In what they were, and they were in communication with the folks doing the audit. So it still is a little strange, the timing that they just suddenly did this with no kind of warning. But I'm not seeing anything nefarious about it, and I suspect that it will live on in some form. As I said, there's folks who have taken the version that's being audited, 7.1a, the last good version. It's been out there actually 2 years already, and are talking about continuing development in the future. They just need to find the guys that are good at crypto to continue developing it.
Okay, well, that's not unusual for somebody else to pick up where other people have left off on these open source, types of software development projects. So hopefully that'll happen, and it'll keep going strong, because it seems like a lot of people out there use it. I know a bunch of us around here have used TrueCrypt and find it to be a good tool. So, okay, so the next story, probably number 3 on the hot sheet in terms of importance, is we talked about Heartbleed probably 2 months ago, which was the SSL vulnerability in certain versions of the OpenSSL software. And I guess there's been some new findings with that, Matt?
Yep.
What's this story about?
So it's called Cupid. Luis Grangia of SysValue recently reported that he was able to make modifications to some popular software used for setting up wireless connections that also relies on the OpenSSL libraries for TLS in protecting different handshakes portions of those connections. In particular, he made modifications to WPA Supplicant, which is a client software, and I want to say Host APD, which is an access point hosting package.
Daemon, right.
Correct. And since we know already that Heartbleed was, you could use it in both directions, client to server and server to client, basically he's showing that it's possible to do this for wireless devices as well. Heartbleed, before we knew it was, you could do it over TCP, which is the standard model. You had a web server, that all those the sites that we knew were vulnerable. Here you can see that at the EAP level, which is lower down in the protocol stack, you can actually do the same kinds of attacks and steal data from memory of a client or a server, depending on which you're running. So it looks like he's released the source code to GitHub, so it's out there. As to which devices in particular are vulnerable, there's a lot of speculation, but I don't know if there's a definitive list anywhere that we could point to yet. But it's not really a surprise, in my opinion. We knew that these libraries were being used in a lot of different places, and they would continue to crop up over time as people spent the time to dig into them and figure out, is this device vulnerable? Hey, what about this one? So I think this is just another one of those. We're going to keep seeing these until the OpenSSL versions get patched pretty much across the board. That may be never, but
So the software that's behind this is still the OpenSSL versions, I can't remember what it was, like 1.01b through
yes,
F or
I
something
believe
like
so.
that.
This is the same kind of memory stealing
It's just
attack.
a kind of different way to access it than we normally traditionally think of.
Right. So
Okay.
you're not actually creating the whole TLS SSL handshake that we're used to on a TCP socket.
Right.
This is lower down.
Right, right. Like you said, probably this is expected. I think we'll probably see other things I think when it first was announced, the Heartbleed vulnerability, we all kind of knew where the low-hanging fruit, which was probably the large portion of web servers and email servers that use for the TLS or the secure POP or whatever it is, were going to be the prime targets. But then there's all these other little things out there that maybe we hadn't thought about, but still have OpenSSL as an underlying encryption protocol. And they're probably not as frequently thought of, but people are discovering new ways to leverage that same vulnerability against other devices and other software packages that might utilize that same OpenSSL software.
Mm-hmm. And this brings us into that space of Internet of Things again,
right?
Where a lot of the hardware that would be running this sort of thing, like an access point, or maybe an Android phone that has the libraries and uses it to create one of those
hotspots.
Hotspots, exactly.
Right. All right, so hopefully they'll get that under control, and hopefully we won't find any more. I don't know if this one's going to be highly exploitable in terms of like a rich target set, but I guess I haven't really looked at the code myself to see, how many are out there. But certainly with the web server aspect, it was a lot more easy for even the entry-level kind of hacker to kind of get into that space, where this might seem a little bit more tricky to get your feet wet. Although if they're releasing the source code, it might not be so bad. Or it might be so difficult.
The key thing here is where the previous one was, was layer 5 or above of the TCP stack. This one's at layer 2. You've got to have physical proximity.
Yep.
You got to be close to the access point or the device to be able to do this. So it is more limited in that fashion. You can't just, like you could with the previous one, scan across the entire internet from anywhere and potentially exploit it. This one does require physical proximity.
So you'd have to do some war driving, have to get back into that kind of mode again in order to maybe discover ones that could be compromised in your area.
Another good point is that EAP is also used for the 802.1x authentication protocol, which can also be used wired. So it's not purely a wireless attack, although I think the majority of the uses that we'll see of it are people who are war driving and using it in that fashion.
Right. All right, well, thanks for bringing that one to our attention. And then I think the last story we have is maybe on a little bit of a different side. Stan likes to bring these ones to us that these kinds of devices might not be the types of things you readily think about with regard to security, certainly when a lot of us think about our computers. But I guess there's been a new ATM vulnerability that was discovered somewhere over in the European area or something like that.
Well, it might have been discovered in the European area, but it was used in the Asian region.
Well, that's okay.
I was reading an article on the Krebs blog, and they mentioned the story about these two Ukrainian nationals being arrested. And in their hotel room, they found a whole bunch of hardware that looked suspicious, and it was basically hardware that were using to steal money from ATMs. This is not new, taking money from ATMs and various kind of physical things against ATMs. It's not a new concept. What was interesting was how they were loading malware onto the ATMs. So usually in the past, attackers put some sort of a skimmer or a keypad or even a video camera to record your keystrokes. There have even been cases of trying to find the USB drive on an ATM and putting some sort of a dongle on there to install malware. In this case, they had these long PCB cards that looked like credit cards, but much longer, maybe the length of 5 credit cards. And they would insert them into where the ATM card would go. And somehow this would cause, I guess some logic in this card, would cause the ATM to reboot. And when it started up, it launched malware, I guess somewhere in the memory of the ATM, which would record all of the credit card numbers and PIN transactions of people. And it would kind of leave no trace. You wouldn't know that the machine was infected when you come up to it. There was no skimmer, there was no keypad, there was no camera. Everything lived in the memory of this ATM. So they could go away and come back a few days later, which they did, with a different PCB card. And when they inserted that one, it would pull off all of the stolen information. And then they used a third card to delete the virus from memory. And using these different cards and inserting them, they kind of didn't give you any clues as to what was going on with the ATM. Now, to me, it sounds like they probably had a lot of knowledge about the specific type of ATM that was involved here in order to be able to develop these cards. But it's interesting that I guess where there is a motivation that they are able to do something like this. They got away with about $100,000. Well, they were able to steal $100,000, but they didn't get away because they got arrested. So it's an interesting story. I know that when I use the ATM, I certainly look for these kinds of suspicious things where there might be something hanging off the ATM, or I know some ATMs have like a blinking feature on the card readers. I make sure that that's present and there's nothing weird on the keypad. But this certainly, you would have no way as a user of the ATM to detect
There's no
something
physical
like this.
additions that have been added to it to kind of clue you in that something's strange here, right?
Right, and that's I guess the concerning thing. And really, the article was kind of light on details. It wasn't clear exactly how the mechanism worked. So it's a little troublesome that we don't know, but again, something to be aware of. And really the only way to protect yourself is to follow your credit card statements and your debit card transactions and your banking statements, just to make sure you know how your money is flowing.
Yeah, and I guess, the interesting thing to me about it is, if this was me, not to say that I would do this, but I kind of find it interesting that they're implanting malware that is recording the card numbers and pins. Why not just implant malware that says, when I type in a code on the keypad, it just dispenses money, and just take the money out of the machine and not even like record any, concept that happened or something. So maybe they just didn't know how to do that with the machine or whatnot. But it seems like that would be at least less victims involved, right? Because it would be the bank itself getting
victimizing the bank directly.
Right.
Which I think there have been malware like that have been exposed. Actually, by Brian, he blogs about these kinds of things all the time. Brian Rexroad.
right.
Not our Brian?
Not our Brian. And in one case, there was malware on an ATM that did just that. You put in some kind of key combination, and it would present to you a special menu where it would tell you how much money was in the ATM, and you could pick which denominations you wanted dispensed to you and how much of each. I know we're used to just the 20s here, but internationally, other banks, they use other denominations in the machine. So you could get different sums of money, not just multiples of 20.
Right.
What I find the most interesting is that the different phases of the operation each had their own separate physical card, from what you said.
Yeah.
One card had to be slotted in for the installation of the malware, one had to be slotted in for retrieval, and a third one had to be slotted in for removal, which to me suggests that there's something, I don't know, either that the guys who developed this are not hardware wizards and had to implement it separately on 3 different PCBs, or there's something very hardware specific about the attack that requires you to have completely different circuits.
I would think that, if I was doing this, which I wouldn't, probably it was easier to implement this way. So they had one specific function for each, and it's also possible.
Convenience.
It could be a convenience factor. It could also be that somebody else developed the PCB cards and gave it to these guys, and you extract the money.
Right.
So money
There's
extraction.
a mastermind behind it, and then maybe some.
And these guys are the ones who get caught with the equipment, but there might be somebody else who developed it, and he's like, well, use this for step 1 and this for step 2, this for step 3.
That sounds pretty plausible.
And I also wonder, there's got to be some sort of interface that has enough, as verbose enough, I guess, because mag stripes by themselves.
Right, don't have a lot of data on them.
Right, but
usually.
If you can upload malware, you've got a significant amount of storage on whatever it is that you're slotting into this machine, and an interface that can accept it too.
Right.
So that raises all sorts of interesting questions, and I'd love to hear more about how this is actually done.
I wonder if they'll be posting more details. It's highly unlikely. I know that discoveries of this nature are made. They try to keep it under wraps and then quickly fix the issue.
I wonder if it's only certain models or vendors of hardware. That might be some programming interface that's available only on a certain model. That's kind of me guessing that. Once it reboots, if you have a card in, it will try to read from that card or something on reboot or something like that.
It could also have something to do with the length of the card. It's possible that further in the machine there is some special card reader
right.
and just uses that same slot.
Because it was long. These things were like probably a foot long at least. It's not the size of your regular debit card. From the
pictures. It might have something to do with that. I guess it's possible, we'll never know, but We know now that the ATM manufacturers are surely aware of it.
Yeah, it's pretty clear that whoever did this knew a lot of details about the specific hardware.
Another interesting thing I thought was apparently the Ukrainian police like to put masks on their the convicts because the mugshots have masks on their heads for some reason.
Apparently, I think that might be in China or Hong Kong where they got arrested. It might be the
Protect their identity.
yeah, something like that. In some countries, you when you're a defendant in court, they put you in a cage, and here, I guess maybe they protect your identity
Okay.
before you're convicted.
Interesting. All right, thanks for that story. So let's take a look at the Internet Weather Report for this week. We have a couple of interesting things, a few that we haven't seen before, I think. So the first one is over the past week or so. This is a 30-day view, and I want to say it's probably been just under a week here. We started to see large amounts of scanning for port 1191 TCP, which I wasn't really familiar with. And I did a little digging. I'm not sure if this is what they're really after here. It's a small number of sources in China performing this scanning activity. This port is associated with the General Parallel File System. It's a file system developed by IBM. Wasn't really familiar with it, although apparently it's used a lot in conjunction with Hadoop, which is a big data solution for storing lots of data, and it's basically a large database type of system. So it's an underlying kind of file system support mechanism for Hadoop. And I don't know if that's what they're looking for here, but apparently somebody is very interested in performing some large volumes of targeted scans for this port and protocol. So if you do, use that one or have that open to the internet, I would definitely take a look at that. Our honeypots didn't pick up any of this activity themselves, but in general, we're seeing a pretty decent volume of scanning activity in the 22 million per hour at certain points for a few hours each day. From these sources that are doing that. I didn't look at what ranges they're scanning here, but I know we've talked about in the past where sometimes when they scan from like 1.1.1.1 all the way to 255, it kind of makes a very distinct pattern because AT&T owns certain address blocks more than others, and you see more volumes of scanning as they go sequentially around. I don't know that that's the case. It just doesn't necessarily look like that's the case in this particular situation, but they're probably looking in certain address blocks more focused than other ones.
Well, it's kind of interesting. Now that I'm thinking about this, if big data is going to be as big a thing as they're saying it is, maybe this one port 1191 is going to be our new MS SQL database that we always see for scans in our Internet Weather Report.
Or MySQL too, like we've seen MySQL and Oracle scanned as well. Probably not as much, but yeah, it's possible. I don't know. Again, I don't know enough about this one because it's very new. But if anybody has any information or any packet captures, we'd certainly be interested in hearing what you've discovered. So, and we'll keep an eye on it as well and report any new findings on that one. The next one is 21 TCP, which is the FTP control port for like setting up a session with FTP. Again, this is regular scanning activity that's coming from China from I think it's actually a decent number of sources in China. I don't remember exactly how many. Again, this is quite a bit more than we saw just on the previous slide. We're up in the between 50 to 75 million flows per hour. Various spikes here on a very regular basis going on. It looks like they take weekends off because there's a definite gap here around that weekend time frame. Not sure what the reason of that is. There was a large spike back on the 24th. I think it's May 24th here. That one is actually attributed to a known research team. We see things where we know there's probably actors that probably not so reputable doing the scanning for maybe perhaps nefarious means. This one, I think we kind of know who these guys are, and they're probably just trying to get a sense of what's out there on the internet in general and maybe record that for other notification and abuse activity type purposes. So if you have FTP open, certainly I would recommend that you monitor that. I think another thing we were talking about earlier today is there's some people out there with anonymous FTP open to the internet, which basically that means anybody can log in anonymously to your FTP server. If you have that, you probably want to watch that pretty carefully. You also want to make sure that those anonymous users can't write to the FTP server. If they are, I would question why you're doing that, because that basically allows them to put whatever they want there, which could be used for malware, could be used for dropping data that they might have stolen from places. So just be careful with that if you do host FTP servers.
And other kind of files that can make you liable legally
Right.
under certain laws.
Right.
It could be very dangerous.
Copyrighted files,
Yeah.
contraband. That
So
sort of
be
thing.
careful with your FTP servers. The next one, this was a little interesting slide. I kind of doubled up here just to show you how this is actually the same actor set here. So again, most of this activity sourcing from China. We got 2 ports displayed here, 3128 TCP, which is mostly associated with the Squid proxy server, 8081 TCP. I'm not sure if there's any particular proxy server software that uses that more than any other, but it's a kind of known proxy port. And you can see on the top is the 3128, and here's the 8081 below, and here's their scanning activity, and you can see they exactly align, which means same actor set scanning the exact same address blocks and ports at the exact same time. So they do like 3128 on an IP address, and then 8081, and then they go to the next one. That's just a good indication where you could tie these 2 activities together pretty concretely, that it's the same actor set looking for that. We see a lot of this activity coming out of China because China has, I guess, regulations on where people can get to, and there's a lot of that activity going on. So frequently their citizens are looking for ways that they can proxy their traffic to get to things the state might not want them to get to, like Facebook and some of these other social media sites and whatnot. And this was the other big surprise this week. We're going to see this again in the top 10 chart, but the scan activity on 135 TCP, which is the DCE RPC locator service. This is associated with Windows, kind of the NetBIOS functionality when you want to make a connection to maybe a file share, or I think there's other services that are supported via 135 TCP on Windows hardware. What we're seeing here is, again, majority is from a few hundred different sources in China. This one's really interesting because it's very focused. It's very focused in a particular address block, the sources that are doing this in China from a specific ISP. Why, I'm not sure. We're still digging into it. The other interesting thing about it is this scanning activity seems to all have a static source port of 4445 TCP. So every scan has the same source port, which I think we know is probably being attributed to the fact that they're using some kind of mass scanning tool like MassScan or ZMap, I think is another one, which tend to use a static source port, and then they have a process that flings the packets out, and then another one just listens on that particular port for anything that comes back. So that's probably what's going on here. The curious thing in my mind is, we see scanning on this, but not nearly the volumes we saw, previously. And then all of a sudden, somebody is very interested in scanning this port, and I'm kind of curious why so aggressively it's being scanned. So this is kind of new activity, within the past few days here. So we'd like to get a little more insight into this one if we can over the next couple of days. Here's the top 10 most probed port chart. And as you can see, this is really taking over the number 1 spot, this 135 TCP. I don't think we've ever seen it this high up in the, we've always seen scanning on this port, but not nearly in the volumes that we've seen. It's in the number 1 position. So that's an interesting kind of artifact of this top 10 chart for this week. Usual cast of characters here, 22 TCP is SSH. You got your telnet on 23 TCP, 445 TCP, also a Windows networking protocol, also associated with a lot of botnet activity because of certain vulnerabilities on that port. 1433 TCP is your Microsoft SQL Server, 53 UDP DNS, 8080 TCP, Tomcat or web or other proxies like to hang out on there. 3389 TCP remote desktop protocol allows you to get into the machine remotely. We've got some icmp and then your HTTPS port 443 TCP. Also put a chart in here this week, just kind of give some indication of where these ports rank this week from the top 10 and where they were last week and the kind of change that they have. So a lot of them are pretty stagnant, shifting 1 or 2 positions. RDP is down 5 positions. It was the number 3 spot last week, but at the same time last week, and now it's down at the number 8 position. But the real interesting one here, and that's kind of why I put this chart in, is that 135 TCP was at the 15th position last week and has moved up 14 spots to number 1, which is kind of impressive in terms of how much scanning we're seeing there.
This reminds me of like a singles hit list, weekly
Yeah.
tracking chart where you
It's the Billboard top 10 of
scanning.
ports and protocols. So here's the most sources probing. So these are, and this has a little less volatility because you've got to get a lot of actors scanning here in order for it to show up on this one instead of just the volume of scanning itself. So this one is not as volatile. You can see that from the top 10 chart here that most of them are pretty steady. They haven't really changed position. A few have gone up and down, and we're going to talk about this one here real quickly. Pretty much the same cast of characters we usually see again. Telnet is in there. We know that there's a lot of these compromised security camera DVRs and other embedded devices that are involved in this 23 TCP scanning, 445 TCP again, 80 TCP, 8080 TCP, both web-oriented stuff. The 27015 UDP crept back up on top of the chart. Well, it's actually, I guess it's usually in there. It looks like it's pretty static from last week. That's your Half-Life gaming server stuff. That's probably not security related. That just happens to look like a lot of scanning because of the way it behaves. The zero-axis botnet, this is the only port still remaining on there, so it'd be good for us to probably take another look and maybe get a fresh chart next week to see how zero-axis is doing over that 2-year time span to see how far it's come down since the Microsoft takedown. We kind of alluded to that earlier in the program. And then 17788 UDP. This one doesn't normally crop up in our top 10, and this is the, if memory serves me correctly, it's PP Stream protocol. It's a streaming television protocol developed out of China. Most of the sources we see are from China. There's some in the US. So that's probably, I'm thinking right now, this is not a security related thing. Probably just an artifact of more increased interest in that streaming television protocol. That is the show for today. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can always do that by sending us email at threattrak@list.att.com. You can also follow us on Twitter to get notice of new episodes that are posted. Our handle on Twitter is @ThreatTraq. And the ThreatTraq video is available on att.com/ThreatTraq and on the AT&T Check channel on YouTube. There is an audio-only version on iTunes as well. Thanks for joining us today. Thank you, Jim, Matt, and Stan for joining me as well. We'll be back next week with a new episode. Until then, keep your network safe.